And this evening, I want to discuss the manner in which we connect science and theism, or science and religion, or science and God. We have to prepare some groundwork before we can discuss the details of theism, because there's many conceptions about how this can be done, many misconceptions. So the idea is to form rather some general ideas by means of which we can generate a proper understanding. And so, as Steve Sanchez said, I was at the University of Surrey, and now I'm at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And just as a disclaimer, this is not an officially authorized result or product of either of those institutions. We saw that this was a series of 4 evenings. This one, the first one, as I said, was connecting science with theism. The second one is we're going to develop some ideas about what are called discrete degrees. The name comes from Swedenborg, but I want to show that there are some other ways of beginning to understand what discrete degrees are. I'll show it by means of examples in physics and psychology. So that's the second lecture next week at the same time. The third week is when we go to understand the principles of theism. And here I'm going to treat theism as if it were a scientific theory that explains what the world is. And so I want to discuss the basic principles of that and work towards correspondences. And in the fourth lecture, we discuss the applications to what I call theistic science, which is a combination of theism and science. And these 4 lectures are all here in this room. We have a nice picture here. And the pattern is that I talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we stop for refreshments. And then after about 8 o'clock or so, we can then have an open-ended discussion. So I can take shorter questions in the first part, but I want to stick more or less to my framework of the talk. And then we'll have much longer and lengthier discussions afterwards. So if you want to take a note of a question or remember a question, I'll be very happy to talk about it. So this first evening is how to connect science and theism. So I'm going to discuss how I think it should be done, how other people think it should be done, and the relative merits of these. And the basic principle is here that theism has empirical consequences. We will discuss those that agree with us, those that disagree with that. And because it has empirical consequences, it can be tested. We can do experiments. Now we have to understand exactly what sort of experiments they are, but if we can test it in some way, if it makes predictions that are satisfied, then it becomes scientific. And furthermore, we're going to explore theism as an alternative to naturalism. Naturalism is the view that natural things or physical things are the only objects that exist. So we're going to explore theism as an alternative to naturalism. And as I said, we're going to look at the principles of theism. And the next week, or the third week, I'm going to go into more details of the principles, but in this lecture, this first lecture, I'm going to give you a quick summary of what I take to be the principles, so in other words, to prepare you for the more investigation later on. And now I said I want to combine science and theism. And if we're going to do that, then science and theism, both of them have to be changed slightly from the way that they're quite often understood. Scientists, in general, believe that all causes are physical. But if we want to understand theism, then, or how God interacts with the world, we have to realize that some causal effects are not physical, or beyond the physical. And that can still be scientific as long as we have a clear idea of what these causes beyond the physical are. So it's a question of developing ideas which enable us to understand what non-physical causes might be. And then religion, as well as science changing, religion has to adapt slightly, because the principles of theism or religion that I'm going to base these principles on, we have a God of unselfish love. And we'll see later what that might include or exclude. Perhaps you think this is obvious, but not everyone thinks it's obvious. And then, towards the end of this first talk, I will look at some history and the way other people have tried to address these questions. And then at the end, I'll discuss some of the topics for later talks. So that's an outline of what I'll discuss first on this first day, because it's only one of the 4. So as I said, I started by saying that theism has empirical effects. It makes predictions about what happens in the world, and these happenings can be observed. I mean, because, well, the opposing view of that is what's called the non-overlapping magisteria view, or NOMA. Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionary scientist, produced this name. And this idea is quite common. Another way of putting it is that science tells us how things happen, and faith or religion tells us why. This is a common way that many people use to divide science from religion. And it has some advantages. It protects science from religion. So if you want to have a religion or a theistic or idea about God that's doesn't feel threatened by science, one way of removing that threat is to say that these are not connected with each other. But this view, this non-overlapping magisterial view, has some serious defects, because if we're to know God, God must be able to influence us now. And if God is to be involved with the world, as most religions say that God is involved with the world, then it must make a difference. And you can argue that if God can't make a difference, if the world has evolved completely as it has, but without God making a difference, then why do you need God if you can have an explanation without God? And so, but even just if we're to have an understanding or knowledge of God, or perception or anything like that, then there must be some influence. And furthermore, religion and theism do talk about what is and not just why things are. For instance, they talk about human nature, where we discuss whether we have souls or minds. These things are disputed by science, so that if theism makes predictions about this, we might be able to understand these things better. We might get a better understanding of psychology, or spiritual psychology, for example. And then in religious history, revelations have occurred. People said that God spoke to them, and then they told us what they said. And we've had a dramatic example of that is incarnation. Someone appears to claim that they are God, or they and God are one. And so this is obviously a serious influence of God on the world, if that was true. Oops. And so what I'm saying is that there are overlaps between theism and the natural world. And if we are to understand what these overlaps are, we have to think seriously about exactly what religion is on one side and exactly what science is on the other. And we have to think of them in such a way that they can be combined, and without collapsing into one, because there are some differences as well as connections. So let's go back to what I call modern naturalism. Naturalism is the view that everything is natural, or nature, physical nature, what they mean, is everything that there is. And this is the implicit view of a lot of scientific investigation, as well as lots of other people who claim that they're following science. And this idea is that naturalism tries to allow only physical explanations for things. Everything has a cause which is physical. So it looks for mechanisms. I have an example here for clockwork. That's a sort of symbol for mechanistic explanation. But of course, and then furthermore, the idea is not to rely on anything about God. So that they have explanations. They have tried to form an explanation about religion, for example, which explains the history of religions and the coming and going of sects and of all sorts of things, but without mentioning God. That's the sort of the naturalistic explanation of religion. But this modern naturalism actually has difficulties, which tend to get brushed over. First of all, it doesn't explain about minds. It doesn't explain that we have minds. It doesn't say anything about minds. It doesn't say anything about consciousness. Consciousness is a rather of a mysterious process to modern naturalism. So there's a lot of debate in the literature among people saying that it can be reduced or it can't be reduced, or it's emergent, or various things. And then even more seriously, we don't have an explanation of the origin of life, the first life that's produced, nor do we have any explanation of why life has this detailed informational structure. The DNA is a coding for other amino acids and proteins. So that fact that there seems to be a design or information built into the basis of life is still a mystery from the naturalistic point of view. Because Darwin, for example, thought that the living cell was just a bag of protoplasm and there wasn't any structure in it. And on that basis, you could imagine small changes to a bag or the collections of bags. But now we know that the DNA and cell structure is very much more complicated. But if you ask a scientist about these things that can't yet explain, they say, oh, but we're going to explain it in the future, and we've made lots of progress, and just in a few years we're going to explain it. But they've been saying that for a long time. And so Karl Popper, as a philosopher, calls this promissory materialism. In other words, the materialists promise that in the future they will have an explanation. And the reply, of course, you've just solved the easy problems. What a David Chalmers, another philosopher, calls the hard problems remain. But the question is, about promissory materialism, how long should we wait? Should we wait 50 years before deciding that materialism has failed, or 500 years? In other words, it's impossible to say yes or no if we always rely on the promise that sometimes science is going to explain these things. So what I want to say now is that we should try alternatives, and we should try them now. So I want to form an idea, develop ideas about theistic science, which connect science and religion without reducing them or separating them either. And we can see what predictions are made. And this should be carried on alongside existing science. So it's like let 1,000 flowers bloom. We should try different ideas at the same time. And this is what I've been developing over the last years, and I've been interested in both physics and Swedenborg and spiritual life of things. So you'll see in these talks the way I've developed in order to combine science and religion, and that I regard as an alternative to the naturalistic science. So you'll see the ideas that I present, and you can judge what they are. Now, I say I want to form an alternative to science. So let's look at what science wants or needs to be scientific. The first thing is that it has to produce explanations. And scientists say they accept the best explanation. This is fairly basic, perhaps. But that means that if I have an alternative view, or if we have an alternative view about the minds and souls and nature and so on, we need to take that theory and make predictions from it, which can explain the things we know. And if they provide a better explanation, then that becomes a scientific idea. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because scientists they say they just follow the best explanation, but they still have an overall view, sort of an ideological view about certain general properties of the world. If you want to have a little telescope like this, and you want to understand how it operates, you need theories about how to observe things. And when Galileo talked to the establishment in his time with his telescope, they knew that telescopes and lenses produced distortion. They weren't sure that looking through a strange glass object showed anything that was actually there, and not just an artifact of the telescope. So in order to understand what telescopes are showing, you need to have a theory and practice and understanding about the details of telescopes. You need to know how to observe. And that means if you observe something which you don't understand, either that means your theory is wrong, or it means that you don't understand how to observe. And so lots of rebuttals to strange things that seem to be beyond science, they say, oh, but people are just imagining it. In other words, they're making a theory about observation. So there's an overall theory which influences everything that goes on. Related to that, you need an overall theory about how causes operate. If we're going to have an idea about causes which are not in regular science, then we need to have a fully fledged theory about what they are and how they operate. So we can talk about them unambiguously. We heard talk of correspondences earlier. That's an idea about how causes operate, but we need to understand the reason for correspondences. We need to understand the basis. And a more general point is that we say science tells us an explanation, but quite often when you look at how scientists think, they have had a theory on their own to start with, and they look for evidence to support it. That's what I'm doing. But it means that, in general, a conclusion about what exists shouldn't depend on the starting point. I mean, a lot of people, they make assumptions and they look for evidence to support it. And I can do that with theism and science. Other people do it with mechanistic or materialistic explanations. And so the only way to get around that difficulty is to have them both at the same time, and then other people compare the two explanations. In other words, it's a pluralistic view about how science should be allowed. So different overall theories should be allowed. So I'm trying to explain that I'm not trying to demolish existing science, but I'm trying to form an alternative structure next to the house of existing science. I'm trying to build another house, which we can build up and then see what it's like to live in. If it gives a better, if it's nicer to live in and it gives a better explanation of scientific things, then we think it would be better. So those are the requirements we think we will need in order to be scientific. So let's think now about how we would go about forming a scientific theory that had theism and God in it. How would we do that? And because material science starts from the assumption that there isn't a God, so what can we do? Well, the obvious thing is to start from an assumption or a postulate that there is a God. We're allowed, if some people's allowed to start by assuming that there is no God, then we can form another building next door which is built on the assumption that there is a God, and we can follow that as an alternative. So it's in contrast to the naturalistic way. And then we have to spell out the basic ideas of theism. We have to spell it out without ambiguity, in a non-metaphorical way. We have to form ideas that can be understood as literally true. I mean, because when people look at, say, Genesis, they say, Genesis, the first chapter is true, but not literally true. Okay, but what is Genesis 1 referring to? That's the question. And if we were to understand what's going on, we should have an idea about what Genesis 1 is actually referring to. And the consequence of this is that no paradoxes are allowed. Okay? Some philosophers are very keen on paradoxes, and here's an example of a visual paradox, a box which is paradoxical in 3 dimensions. You can't have that in 3 dimensions. So, by paradox, I mean two things which contradict each other. Saying some philosophies of religion say that we are God, but we're distinct from God at the same time. Okay, so that's what I mean by a paradox. When two things are held that appear to contradict each other, or do contradict each other, but they're held at the same time. So that means we want to avoid all paradoxes, because it's well known from the logical point of view that if you have two things which contradict each other at the same time, then you can prove anything. That's the general feature of an inconsistent system is useless. So we want to keep rational consistency. And so therefore we emphasize a lot the rational consistency of the ideas that we're trying to present. And then furthermore, this is a general question. Actually, it's a matter of taste, but this is the way that I've decided to proceed. Instead of saying that minds are nothing but brains, or that souls are nothing but minds, or that God is nothing but something, an idea in our mind, or God is nothing but the cosmos, or everything that there is, I want to avoid these, what I call reductionists, or nothing but explanations. We need to have a proper account of how there could be, for example, minds, and how they're related to brains, how they're connected, but they're not equal to each other. They're distinct, they're causally, one can affect the other can affect the one, and without demolishing to say we don't actually have minds. Because if we don't have minds, we don't think, we don't have ideas, we don't have feelings. So it's a serious problem to deny that there are minds. Then lastly, to make theistic science, we want to make predictions and compare with experiments. And we say that if the predictions are confirmed, then this is evidence in support of theistic science. That's the general principles of doing science, and we'll see as we do this whether it whether you agree that the starting point is confirmed. Because, we'll discuss later how you can prove things. Now, if I present these ideas to a scientific group, there are some standard responses that they make. Some scientific objections to theism, and the first one is that if God were allowed as an explanation in science, then anything goes. They say no matter what happens, you can say, oh, God did it. The explanation of God did it could be used for any event whatsoever. Because God, they think of as some person with a free will outside reality who's not bound by any of the natural laws or anything, and so they think that's sort of so overwhelmingly different and would interfere with everything that they do. And if that were to happen, then you couldn't form any rules or patterns or regular or irregular activities. Comprehensible or incomprehensible things could equally well be explained by God. If God was making miracles happen all the time, then this wouldn't make sense. You couldn't do science like this. But we want to start by replying to this objection, is that God is not some arbitrary and capricious old man who can do what he likes. I mean, it's clear that as you get better at understanding of religion, there's a certain constancy and reliability about God, which not everyone agrees with, but as you get a better understanding, in my opinion, in fact, as the religions and the churches get a better understanding of God, it doesn't look like this. So that means that if we want to allow for scientific theism, we want to say that the previous reasons for opposing theism in science arise from misunderstandings about the nature of God. And we'll discuss, that's why we have to make it quite clear what the foundations for our theism is and explain it in a simple, rational way, without contradiction, without paradox, and to avoid these particular misunderstandings. And I believe that with the help of Swedenborg, we'll see later, there are some basic ideas which can be used in this way. And as I said, we know that there are considerable regularities in the world. And we should be able to explain the source and nature and reasons for these regularities. And as an example of this, we can say that the source of regularities might be the constancy and eternality of the love and wisdom of God. So that's a beginning of an explanation within theistic science about why there are regularities, but we then have to explain lots more about how these, with love and wisdom of God, operate and what the regularities that result in what they are. And so we have a little picture here. I think it's a Islamic picture. We'll talk about the sun. The sun, okay, the sun is a good metaphor or a simile for God. Lots of religions have the shining star or the sun as a... God isn't a sun, S-U-N, but it's a source of light and heat, and that's similar, we believe, to love and wisdom. So let's dig a little bit more into what these basic ideas of theism are, what we might use as the starting point for understanding theism. Where to begin theism? The traditional way of understanding theism in philosophy is to say that God is the eternal, omnipotent, omniscient being who created and sustains the world. This is the traditional way of defining God, or thinking of God within theism. But the trouble is that this view, we can have a little picture there, these attributes don't have specific consequences for the way minds, mental things and spiritual things operate. They're different from each other. They're different from God. People who take this first view believe that this means that we have minds and souls, that it makes obvious that it's obvious to them that if there was a God like that, then he would give us minds to think and whatever, and bodies to do things with. But it doesn't really tell us what our minds are like, or it doesn't tell us what our bodies are like. It doesn't say, why is there a physical world, in fact? Why couldn't God create everyone all at once, for example? And so I would suggest rather that we want not just a God as the philosophers, this eternal, omnipotent, this omni-being, but we want something, a God of the living. We want something to do with life and love. And so I have a different way of defining who God is. It's still a theistic view. God is that person who is a necessary being, who is unselfish, love itself, wisdom itself, and in fact life itself. So it's these itselfs, these per se or aseity, that I'm regarding as the essential features of God. And God enlivens our world. It doesn't just create and sustain it from a distance, but enlivens it even now. So this idea of God as a person is not necessarily in the first definition of God. But most people think that it is, but they have the idea of a person there. But we have to. But in order to understand about being a person, we have to understand what we are. So that a full understanding of God as a person requires knowing in what way we humans are persons, and so and the connection between these things. So there's lots to understand more about God and more about the way people are when they have mental and spiritual life. And an important feature is unselfish there. That's what I mentioned earlier on about religion requiring love to be unselfish. We'll see later on what sort of predictions you would make if God wasn't unselfish. Okay? We'll see that this unselfishness of God has specific consequences for the way the world is organized. To give a preview, it makes it into a pantheistic world rather than a theistic world. And so we can have a bright shining light, but there's a human being behind the light, if we want to use that picture of the God that we're talking about. So this is just a reorientation of how to start theism, which is different from the traditional philosophical way of starting theism, but it's closer to what I think we need in order to make predictions about the world. And I think if you ask most people, they would agree that this is the same God that's being talked about, but this is a more specific identification of what we need. So if we were to go and look at what this idea, what this living theism contains, it contains several principles, and these are the main principles that I'm going to use during this presentation. The first one, as I said, is that God is love. Now, on the slide after this, we'll show what the justification is from Christianity, but most people recognize that God is love, and it's unselfish love, as I've said, and that means that it cannot love only itself. In fact, it can't love itself at all, to take an extreme view of unselfishness. The second thing is that God is wisdom. God as well as love. So and when love and wisdom act, then you have power that makes things happen, and your action, which is the happening itself. So these are the components, spelling out in a little bit more detail from the previous slide. And then we look into a bit more detail. We say that God is life itself. This is also based in religion. I think most people who have an understanding of theism and religion will agree that God is the source of life. It's the source of all our powers or dispositions to think and to act and to will and to do things. So these are the principles, and we have to understand how all these things happen. That's part of the understanding of theistic science, all the steps involved. Because the fourth principle is that everything in the world is a kind of image of God, which means that all minds, all natural objects, everything, from a finger to a sun or a galaxy or a beetle, is an image in some way. Everything is different, but that they're in some way an image of God. And in particular, image of these aspects, the love, wisdom, and life that comes from God. Because everything is living, everything has powers to act and do things, and so therefore we need to understand how it is that each object in the world, whether it's living or not living, spiritual, mental, or physical, each of them can do things, and I'm claiming that in theism, everything comes from God. And the fifth one is that, saying the same thing again, I suppose, that our life from God derives from the divine power. And the life we have depends on us. In other words, a little image here is that the sun, the solar system, the sun and the solar system shines on everyone. So when it comes to the earth, it's the same intensity. But the earth rotates. You have days and nights. We vary. But so that therefore our reception of the solar light varies, but the sun itself is constant. And so on. This depending on us means that the life which we receive from the source depends on our abilities to receive it and retain that life and to act upon it. So this set of principles was first suggested by Emanuel Swedenborg in his book Divine Love and Wisdom a long time ago, but I think it's still just as useful. These principles, I think, have more predictive power than to say that God is omnipotent and omniscient and eternal, because there's a lot of debate about what omnipotence means. Does it mean everything logically possible? Does it mean everything good? Does it mean everything that's not contradictory to the nature of God? There's a lot of discussion about what omnipotence means, and you can't actually produce many consequences of God being omnipotent, because you'd expect God to act, we would naively expect God to act a lot more often than he appears to do. So there's, people complain that God isn't acting or not acting. So that's the picture of Emanuel Swedenborg. So those 5 principles, I claim, are common to the theistic religions, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And if we just look at the support for these principles in Christianity, the first one, God is love, is actually stated rather boldly in John. And God being wisdom, the source of all wisdom. In the Proverbs, God gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. That God is life itself is stated again rather specifically in John 5, Gospel of John. The Father has life in himself. The eternal God has life in himself, or is life in himself, I believe is the same thing. And that also has specific consequences, which we'll see in the third lecture when we come to discuss the kind of creatures that God could create and the kind of ways in which this created creature can live from the life that comes from God. There are many specific consequences and predictions that are made on the basis of just these principles. The image of God, of course, is a traditional one in Judea. In Genesis, God created man in his own image. So I'm actually generalizing that. I'm saying that everything is an image of God, but in a reduced way. Man might be the best image of God, or good men or good women might be, but everything, animals, we know there's a lot of similarity between animals and humans in their physiology, and even with plants, and there's a lot of similarity. We consume food from the world. And our life is from God. There's another general principle which we've got here, the free gift of God is eternal life. And so there's many... So these principles are not stated exactly in the Bible as I've written them here, but I believe, and I will justify, that they form a good basis for understanding the principles that lie behind the Christian religion, and then can be used to predict how a religious life should follow, and how theism and how God is related to the world. So this is just, I want to understand the details of things. I understand the basic principles. I'm a physicist. I want to understand, if you have a quantum theory, you write down the principles of quantum theory, and then you use them to make predictions and apply them in specific cases. So what I'm doing here is using some ideas from Manuel Swedenborg and extracting just what I think of as a minimal set in order to carry on and answer questions about the world. As an example of the questions to be answered, the first one is rather obvious. How can there be a personal God? Lots of people don't understand how there can be a personal God. My mother thinks that God is a cloud, some kind of in the sky, a shining light. How is that possible? And then there's the question of whether the world is made of one substance, monistically, or two, which is dualism, or whether there are many levels. Okay? You'll have heard discussion of planes of existence or the multiple dimensions of existence, but we'll discuss, those are metaphors for what I'm trying to talk about here, but not themselves very accurate descriptions. So but that's a sort of question we have to answer. And next week we'll have more discussions about levels. Okay, that's the same question there. And then, once we've answered those questions, we can then get on to what is the connection between the mind and the body. Once we have fully existing minds and brains, once we have multiple levels or planes, or whatever you call them, of minds and brains, we then have to discuss how they're related, because obviously when you think of something in your mind, you can move your hand. Obviously your ideas can influence the physical world, and the question is how that's possible. And when you see things, physical worlds affects what you think. That's obviously happens, and so how. And then a rather more general question about the history of all of these things. How do these physical, biological, and mental structures come into existence? By that I mean, how do they come into existence historically? And we can discuss the history and the growth of an individual person. What happens when you're born and you grow up as a child? Children develop, they learn things in many different stages, and they get better at some things, and other things change and differ. And then there's the question of evolutionary coming into existence of life. How about evolution? What do these principles say about the production of new species, or the development of new kinds of processes, organs and bodies? And then there's also the question of how the world came into existence at the very beginning. We think of it as a Big Bang. Genesis has another story, and so there's other where you have to think about how God might have started off the world. I said at the beginning that if we were to take these ideas of theistic science, which is combining science and religion, there's a little bit of adjustment of religion needed and a little bit of adjustment of science. I'm going to say again what these little adjustments are, and hope they're not too difficult for you. I've said this several times. God is a being composed entirely of love, and moreover, completely unselfish love. And the consequence of that is that anger and jealousy and exclusiveness and selfishness are completely foreign to God. Now, you may think that's obvious, but God is often portrayed as angry and jealous. And if you read the Bible, you'll see places where the wrath of God is happening and it does things terrible, and it's clearly, people say, the biblical God is angry sometimes, depending on what you do. And so we have to have an explanation of why the biblical God appeared to be angry. If we were to follow through the proposal that I'm making, then you have to have a scientific explanation of why, in historical times, God appeared to be angry and jealous. And as I said, it's our variations which lead to God having varying appearances to us. And so there's questions about spiritual psychology, and in particular, I'm claiming that part of the theory we need, is that when we are angry, God appears to be angry with us. I'm sure you know, if you have children, that if your children are angry with the parents, then their parents appear to the children to be angry. There's a sort of mirror. You look through the haze of the window of your own feelings when you see other beings. I mean, it's not particularly difficult psychology, but you have to examine that and see whether it applies to the way God appears to humans over history. So that's a question of adjusting religion. We then have a way of adjusting science. I said we have to, earlier on when I talked about adjusting science, I said we have to consider that there are causes beyond the physical. And so we have to allow physical processes to depend on individual minds and even on the transcendent mind of God. So in other words, there has to be a way of mental and spiritual and divine things influencing what the world is. I said at the beginning, there has to be some influence, otherwise we wouldn't know about these things. But there has to be a way, so to speak, a law-like way, a reasonable and logical and rational way in which these influences occur. And so we have to understand science and religion in that. And more to the point in science, we have to not refuse to even consider the evidence for such things happening, because some people say in advance, I'm a naturalist, a physicalist, it's impossible for these things to happen. Therefore, for instance, they say, there's no good evidence for life after death. But if you look at the last 150 years of societies for psychical research and lots of near-death studies and medium studies and all sorts of things, you find an enormous amount of evidence for the continuing existence of life after death. But they say there's no evidence. They just refuse to look at the evidence because, as I said earlier on, you have to have an overall theory about what evidence is acceptable. And so therefore, if you're stuck in a little bubble in which you say only physical evidence that I prove is reasonable to consider as evidence, then you have to try an alternative. So I'm trying to present an alternative way, an alternative, rational, logical way of seeing how religion might operate and how there might be life after death, for example, in a logical and reasonable way, in a way that makes sense and without being vindictive or without God punishing people, because a God of love would never punish people, for example. And as an example of evidence, we have the Xena cards, which are ESP has been detected many times over the last 100 years. And so that means that science, this is talking about adjusting science, science shouldn't be frightened by new ideas. Many scientists or parapsychologists say they just want to produce more evidence, they want to produce proof that there is ESP or whatever. But proof never really works, okay? Because you can always you can dig your little loopholes in the proof. And so it's a matter of balance of evidence, balance of probabilities. So when we come to this question of proof, I want to discuss briefly about proof. And the question is, what does theistic science prove? Is it possible to prove that there is a God, for example? And in fact, from Aristotle and popularized by Augustine and even more by Thomas Aquinas, there are various proofs of God, about the first cause, about the first actuality, about the moral law, proofs about God. But they depend on understanding about nature. Aquinas used this Aristotelian understanding about nature. So I'm not going to use these proofs. They still exist, they're still valid, but they depend on some basic ideas about causes. And if you're changing basic ideas about causes, you have to look at what they are before going to these general proofs. So I'm not going to argue natural theology is the branch of theology that argues from nature and science to God. There's lots of people, they look at the recent results of science and they say this can only happen if there was a God. Okay, so I'm not going to do that. So other people could do that, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to what I do, theistic science, which doesn't try and doesn't try and logically prove these 5 postulates. Rather, I'm going to start from those postulates, I'm going to start from those 5 principles of theism and see what predictions I make about what the world is like on the basis of those principles. And this is the opposite view to natural theology. It's what I would call sort of theistic science or theology of nature. And this is the way science normally operates, in fact. It starts, if you have a good science, you have general principles of relativity theory or electromagnetism or quantum theory. These people start off, if they have a good understanding, they know what the principles are, they start from the principles and make predictions. And if the predictions are satisfied and confirmed, then it supports the starting point. And that's all I'm going to try. So at the end, you'll see what this theistic science looks like after I've started from my five starting assumptions and made predictions about nature, about minds, about spiritual life, about evolution, psychology, and so on. So the second talk next week is setting some basic structure in order to do. I said we have to discuss some causes. So next week, Tuesday, there's not much theism. It's some basic ideas about, first of all, about substance and form. And I'm going to give a little preview tonight. I think we have a bit of time about substance and form, so you get an idea of what way to think about it next week. Because I want ideas of substance and form which are applicable to all processes, physical, mental, spiritual, whatever. I want some general ideas which can be applied to all of these things. And in this, I'm following the approach of Aristotle, not Aquinas. Aquinas, we'll see in a minute, does things slightly differently. And the second thing, next week, is rather basic to understanding all of this about theism, is that I'm going to develop the concepts of multiple levels. You might think of them as dimensions or planes, but I want to make a more specific idea, an ambiguous, non-metaphorical, literal way of understanding multiple levels. I'm going to use some examples from physics and psychology. So there will be a little bit of physics introduced. If you can remember about forces and acceleration, that might help next week. And I'm going to use what I call principles of generation and selection. I'm going to claim that these can be used to connect physical things and mental things, using these principles. Because up to now, the physicists have an idea of what physics is, and mental things just seem to be outside this in a very strange way. But they have no clear idea of what the connections between them. They've got no general principles which even produce the connections. And so this is what I want to show. So we're going to end up with the concept of discrete degrees, which will be extremely useful as we go on. I think we're getting there. I'll go a little bit faster in the remaining few minutes. The first topic next week is substance and form, and I'll probably show this slide again, but we think of substance as the thing from which objects are made, and the form is the shape that they have. Okay, that's the general idea of substance and form. And in quantum physics, it's not clear what substance and form are, so we need to have an idea which can be used there as well. Plato, the first Greek philosopher, well, actually, the first one who wrote a lot, forms are eternal, but we're trapped on earth. Aristotle emphasized the need for form and substance and change. He said they're all essential. And I'm actually going to follow this. I'm going to apply this principle of form and substance and change to every physical thing, mental thing, spiritual thing. So we can have an idea of mental substance and spiritual substance. Aquinas, however, thought he was taking principles from Aristotle, but he took matter as the substance of things and claimed it was inert, and in the minds he thought were the forms. But that's, in my opinion, getting it wrong, because that minds then don't have any substance, which is a little bit odd. He thinks that the forms of things can separate, but they're not really living. So you can have life after death, but not in a sort of fully fleshed form, a fully embodied form. Isaac Newton had a theory of matter. Isaac Newton was a theist. He believed God of theism interacted and influenced the world. He had a theory of matter, of corpuscles, which are substances, elastic substances in a form. So it was consistent, but I just claim quantum physics knows that this is consistent but wrong. Leibniz, on the other hand, started a trend of separating things. He said, minds don't interfere in nature. He postulated what he called pre-established harmony. In other words, the minds and the bodies go along in parallel. They do things like this. They vary as though they're influencing each other, but they're not really. And this idea of minds not influencing nature was really taken up by the physicists, because then they had an idea of nature in which minds interfere. And there was no influence from minds. And so this is the beginning of the end, so to speak, of theism. Because Swedenborg came just after Leibniz, and he said that you can know spiritual things and mental things. You can know about these different discrete degrees. But Kant read Swedenborg, and he claimed, despite what Swedenborg said, that spiritual things cannot be observed. He just said that Swedenborg was seeing things, and it was a little bit crazy. Okay, he just wrote things that he claimed to have seen, but he didn't really see them. And so, as I said, it's easy. If you can have a general theory, it must include a theory about what evidence is acceptable. And so, therefore, you can put the boundary between acceptable evidence and unacceptable evidence in various places. And you've got to think carefully about the consequence of putting the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable evidence, because it has big effects. Kant has the traditional view, which is taken on now. Science has ignored spiritual causes since Kant, because he said that the natural world was like that of Newton, and he revered Newton, and he was so wanting to be for mental things in philosophy like Newton was for science. But I'm going to go back to Aristotle, okay? I'm going to use the basic idea from Aristotle is that form and substance and change are all essential. So nothing is made out of pure form, nothing is made out of pure substance. Okay, so if we go, I'm going to list some bad proposals, okay? This is just to whet your appetite, so that some of you, I'm sure, will regard these members of this list here as your preferred way of thinking about mind and nature. I'm sure some of you think like this. But I just want to set up a little bit of an opposition to that, so that we can then talk about it. Oops. Okay, I've got funny water here. But a common idea is that mental things are in the fourth dimension, or the fifth dimension of physical space. But then you can rotate it, and then mental things become physical. Another idea is that minds are abstract. High abstract thinking is spiritual, but that's not really true, because that's just all ideas are abstract in some way. Oh, that's the old ones. Another idea popular these days that minds are active information, but information is form of things. Information tells you the form. It doesn't tell you anything about the substance. When you receive an email, you're actually receiving the form, the structure. The substance is not being sent at all. Only the form is being sent on the computer. So the form is extracted and copied and conveyed on in many different substances, from microwaves to radio waves to light to electrons, etc. There's various ideas of mental and spiritual things being a high frequency vibrations. This is commonly held in that, actually I hear sometimes that it's very low frequency vibrations or very high frequency vibrations, I'm not quite sure. But the point is, no matter how fast you vibrate, if it's still physical things vibrating, it's not any different from the physical. And frequency is just a time, and a vibration is a form. If something is vibrating, that's the form, the waveform. It doesn't tell you anything about the substance. So there's no mention of substance if you're only talking about frequency of vibration. Another idea is that minds and spiritual is outside time. But if you take that view, then nothing in the spiritual world could happen. No changes would occur, which would make it a rather unpleasant place to live. Idea from the Romans is that mental things are spiritual, subtle substances, or very fine that fits in the gaps of physical things. But it's in physical space, but very fine substance. And then recently we have these other ideas that if you just take the holistic view of nature or of the body, that tells you what the mental life of the body is. But that's really still talking about physical substances. And similarly, if you take the cosmos as a whole, with expanded consciousness, to consider the whole universe, that if you do that, you're spiritual. But this is still talking about the physical universe. And then others say that quantum physics tells us about spirituality, but in fact, quantum physics is about physics. There's some structure in quantum physics which tells us a little bit about discrete degrees, which we'll see next week. And discrete degrees are useful to understand the relation between mental and physical things. But quantum physics doesn't itself do that. So, another set of contemporary proposals is chaos theory, is that because there's a sensitivity to starting conditions, physics can never make complete predictions. And some people use this as a way of introducing minds, because physics can't make predictions. But it's not really about predictions. Minds, the question of whether minds really do have an effect is something which is independent of predictability. Some strange ideas, quantum measurement by Deepak Chopra. He says minds influence brains by non-local correlations. But actually, non-local correlations in quantum physics do not convey information at all. That's the way it's done. There are non-local correlations, not causal effects, so that influencing can't occur. Another idea is that there's a quantum vacuum, which is the reality behind the physical world, and that this quantum vacuum is consciousness. But we'll see next week that the quantum vacuum is a discrete degree just above or behind. It is indeed behind the normal reality that we know, but it's not actually consciousness. It's still a physical reality. If you want to combine mind and nature, an idea which is called panpsychism, which is that everything has some psychic component. In other words, everything is like a physical side, like a coin. There's a physical side and a mental side. That's panpsychism. Everything has both sides. But then it's the one substance being physical and mental. So mental and physical are just different forms, different ways of talking about the forms of the same substance. So you can't survive the death of your physical body if the mind's an aspect of looking at the brain. And furthermore, if the physical properties were causally sufficient, then that predicts everything that you need to know about those objects without the mental side having any effect. So, the last slide is what we've discussed today. We've discussed the general questions of how to relate science and theism. We've discussed making theistic science, how to make a sort of beginning of a science. We've discussed principles of theism, and then the question of substance and form. And so we'll be discussing substance and form more next week. So for today, I've introduced the idea of substance and form so that it can percolate in your mind for next week. And then the last thing, I looked at other attempts to link mental and physical things, and a rather brief explanation of why I think those are inadequate. But if you want to discuss them more after the break, which is happening now, we'll do that. Thank you.